Ion had always believed that time would soften everything, the memories, the pain, the silence. But tonight, as he stood alone in the dimly lit room, he realized that time had not softened anything. It had only carved everything deeper. Every echo of the past felt sharper, every remembered word felt heavier, and every regret felt louder than before. He could taste the bitterness of everything he had lost, as if the past had crawled back into his chest and settled there, refusing to leave again. He walked slowly toward the window, the wooden floor creaking beneath his feet. Outside, the night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like the world had paused just long enough for your thoughts to catch up to you. But Ion knew the world hadn't paused. He had been stuck for years, living in the shadow of something he couldn't change, trapped beneath the weight of everything that had already happened. His fingers brushed against the cold glass of the window. He closed his eyes and exhaled, imagining her face again, the softness of her smile, the warmth in her eyes, the quiet sadness she carried like a hidden bruise. She used to joke that he saw everything in her except the parts she wanted him to notice. She wasn't wrong. He had always sensed her slipping away long before she actually did, but he had never known how to reach out and pull her back. He had loved her in silence, and silence had taken her away. He remembered the last time they talked, not the awkward goodbyes or the forced words, but the real conversation, the one before everything began to break. She had leaned against the same window he was touching now, looking out at the rain as if searching for something she didn't have the courage to name. He had asked her what she was thinking about, and she had laughed softly, saying, "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." But the truth was written in her eyes. She was already halfway gone. He didn't say anything then. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't tell her he loved her. He just let the moment slip through his fingers like sand, believing they would have more time, believing that she wasn't really leaving, not in the way that mattered. How foolish he had been. Ion opened his eyes again, blinking away the heaviness gathering behind them. The room felt smaller now, as if all the memories trapped inside its walls were closing in on him. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, letting his body sink into the worn-out mattress. The air smelled faintly of dust and old books. He had kept them exactly where she left them, untouched, unread, as if preserving them preserved her too. He reached toward the bedside drawer, pulling out the small notebook she used to carry everywhere. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of being held. He flipped it open carefully, almost afraid that the pages might crumble beneath his fingers. Her handwriting filled the page's soft curves, uneven lines, little doodles in the margins. She had always written to make sense of herself, but Ion wondered now if he had ever truly read her, truly understood what she needed, or what she feared. One page was folded at the corner. He opened it, and there it was, the one thing he had avoided reading all these years. Her words were simple, but they cut through him with a quiet violence. "Maybe one day he'll understand why I had to go. Maybe one day he'll see that staying would have broken me more than leaving did." Ion let the notebook fall from his hands. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The weight in his chest spread through his ribs, crawling up his throat until he felt like he was swallowing stones. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, trying to hold himself together, but the ache was too intense, too old, too familiar. He had spent years blaming himself for losing her, for pushing her away, for not seeing the cracks forming in her voice, in her smile, in her silence. But now, reading her truth written in her own hand, he felt something worse. He felt the weight of everything he could never fix, everything that had already happened, everything that was already gone. Maybe she did what she had to. Maybe she left because staying meant drowning. Maybe her leaving wasn't a punishment, but a kind of desperate attempt to save herself. But none of it eased the ache inside him. None of it brought her back. None of it erased the emptiness carved so deeply into him that even time refused to fill it. He leaned back, his head hitting the wall behind him. The room blurred. The silence felt heavier than any scream. For years he had told himself that he would move on, that he would outgrow the pain, that life would eventually give him something to replace what he lost. But nothing ever came close. Nothing ever even tried. Maybe some people don't get second chances. Maybe some stories remain unfinished. Maybe some wounds never close. Ion knew only one thing for certain. Now, even if the world never understood the weight he carried, it didn't matter. It was his reality, his burden, his truth. And tonight, for the first time, he allowed himself to feel every bit of it. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Ion sat by the window, the cool breeze brushing against his face. It was a rare night, quiet, still, the kind where memories seemed to resurface. as if the universe had paused to give him a moment of reflection. He hated it. The stillness of the night had always been his enemy, reminding him of the things he couldn't change, the things he had lost. The silence was almost unbearable now. It had been 5 years since she left, but the emptiness felt as fresh as if it had happened only yesterday. He had learned to exist with it, to fill the hours with distractions, with work, with meaningless conversations, but it never lasted. There was always that hollow space inside of him, a place that no amount of busyness could fill. His eyes wandered to the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. He used to hate the nights, the long hours that stretched before him like a never-ending tunnel. But tonight, the darkness felt different. It felt like an invitation, a challenge to finally confront the things he had been avoiding for so long. Ion's mind flashed back to the first time he had met her. It had been a casual encounter, nothing extraordinary. He had been at a mutual friend's party, standing in the corner, nursing a drink, trying not to feel out of place. And then she walked in, her presence immediate, undeniable. There was a softness in the way she moved, a grace that seemed to make the world around her slow down. Ion hadn't known it at the time, but that night would change everything. That night would be the beginning of a love he would never be able to forget. Their first conversation had been awkward to people stumbling over words, trying to figure out who the other was. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Ion want to keep talking, to know her better. They had spent the rest of the night talking about everything and nothing, as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving just the two of them. It was strange how quickly it felt natural, how easy it was to fall into step with her. The days that followed were filled with the kind of simple joys that only come when two people are beginning to fall in love. The late-night phone calls, the stolen moments, the shared silences. But even then, there had been something unspoken between them. Ion had felt it from the start, an invisible distance that he couldn't cross. It wasn't that she wasn't there. It was that she was already somewhere else. Somewhere Ion couldn't reach. He remembered the day she told him she was leaving. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind where everything seemed calm on the surface but was swirling with turmoil underneath. They had been sitting together in the park, the breeze ruffling the leaves overhead. Ion had noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap. It was in that moment, in the pause before her words, that Ion knew something was wrong. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He had stared at her, not understanding at first. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart racing in his chest. "I'm leaving," she repeated. "It's not something I want, but it's something I have to do." Ion had felt his world shatter in that moment. He had wanted to scream, to tell her that they could fix whatever was broken, to beg her to stay. But instead, he had remained silent, unsure of what to say, unsure if he even had the right to ask her to stay. "Why?" he had finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. She had looked at him with a kind of sadness in her eyes, a sadness that Ion had never been able to understand. "Because sometimes, love isn't enough. Because sometimes you have to leave to find yourself. Because I'm not who you think I am." The words had hung in the air between them, each one heavy with a truth he couldn't grasp at the time. She had never explained further, never told him the reasons behind her decision. And in the years since, Ion had come to realize that some things weren't meant to be understood. Some things were just meant to be felt. The next few months had been a blur of confusion, of trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Ion had tried to reach out to her, texts, calls, even letters, but she had vanished. Her absence had been as abrupt as her departure, and it left him reeling, lost in a sea of unanswered questions. He had searched for answers everywhere. He had asked their friends, people who had been close to her, but they all said the same thing. They didn't know. No one knew why she had left, why she had chosen to disappear without a trace. They all just assumed that one day, she would come back, that one day, things would make sense. But that day never came. Ion had learned to live without her, though it wasn't easy. There had been nights when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had happened, what he could have done differently. There were days when he would see something that reminded him of her favorite song playing on the radio. The scent of lavender in the around, it would hit him like a wave, pulling him under, drowning him in the memories of everything that was lost. It wasn't until much later, after years of silence, that Ion had received a letter from her. It arrived without warning, a simple envelope with his name written in her familiar handwriting. He had stared at the letter for hours before finally opening it, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm sorry," the letter had read. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I wasn't strong enough to stay. And now I don't know how to come back. But I hope you find happiness, even if it's without me." The letter had ended there. No explanation, no answers. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last fragment of a broken relationship that could never be mended. It didn't give him closure. It only deepened the wound. Ion crumpled the letter in his hand, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. "I wasn't strong enough to stay." He repeated the phrase over and over, as if somehow it would make sense. As if somehow it would answer the question that had haunted him for years. But there were no answers, not really. There never would be. The silence in Ion's apartment was oppressive, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. He had tried to drown out the noise in his head, tried to distract himself with work, with mundane conversations, with the things that used to matter, but nothing worked anymore. The silence was louder than anything else. The emptiness she had left behind was more deafening than any noise could ever be. Ion sat in the same chair he had sat in 100 times before, the one that faced the window, the one where he would wait for her, imagining her smile as she walked through the door. But that door had remained closed for years now, and the smile that once brought warmth to his heart had faded into a memory, so distant it almost felt like it belonged to someone else. Her letter had been the last link to her fragile, delicate, and irrevocably final. She had made her choice, and Ion had no right to ask for more, no right to demand answers. Yet, despite everything, he still felt the sting of betrayal. It wasn't that she had left him, it was how she had done it. She had vanished, disappeared into the ether without so much as a trace. No phone calls, no messages, no explanation, just an empty space where she had once been. Ion had spent years trying to fill that space. He had thrown himself into his work, poured all his energy into meaningless projects, trying to prove to himself that he was fine, that he had moved on, that he didn't need her anymore. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't moved on. He couldn't. Not when her absence had carved a hole in him so deep that nothing could fill it. That hole had only grown wider over time. The longer he went without seeing her, without hearing her voice, the more he realized how much he had lost. It wasn't just her presence that he missed, it was everything about her. The way she could make him laugh when he didn't feel like smiling. The way she understood him without him having to say a word. The way she always knew when something was wrong, even before he did. She had been his other half, the part of him that made him feel whole. And now she was gone. Ion closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him, memories of better times. Of simpler times, when the world had seemed less complicated. He remembered the way they used to spend hours talking, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and insecurities. It was in those moments that he had felt truly connected to her, truly seen. But somewhere along the way, those moments had become fewer and fewer, until they had disappeared entirely. And when they had disappeared, so had she. He had never told her how much he needed her, how much he had depended on her, and now he couldn't help but wonder if it had been too late. If his silence had been the thing that pushed her away, if his inability to open up had caused her to pull away. He had always been so afraid of being vulnerable, so afraid of showing her the parts of himself that weren't perfect. He had never wanted her to see the cracks in his facade, the parts of him that were broken, but in doing so, he had never truly let her in. He had kept her at arm's length, never fully trusting her, never fully believing that she could handle the mess inside him. And in the end, that had been his undoing. His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, expecting another email or a reminder about a meeting. But it wasn't either of those. It was a message from an unknown number. Ion's heart skipped a beat as he hesitated for a moment before opening it. "I know this is sudden, but I need to talk. Can we meet?" It was a simple message, but its simplicity was what unsettled him. He stared at the screen for a long time, his finger hovering over the reply button. His mind raced. Who could this be? What could they want? The message could have been from anyone, but his gut told him it wasn't just anyone. It felt too familiar, too important. Could it be her? Could it be her finally reaching out after all these years? Ion quickly typed out a response. "Where?" The reply came almost instantly. "The park. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Ion's heart pounded in his chest. He stood up quickly, pacing around the room. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What if this was her? What if she had come back? He didn't know what he would do if he saw her again, how he would feel, what he would say. A part of him was afraid, terrified even, of what that meeting might mean. Another part of him, the part that still loved her despite everything, was desperate to see her again, to hear her voice, to finally understand why she had left. He thought about everything he had been through since she left. How he had built a life without her. How he had learned to survive without her. But surviving wasn't living. Not really. Not when a part of him was still stuck in the past. Still holding on to a version of her that no longer existed. The message felt like an invitation. A chance to close the chapter of his life that had been left open for far too long. But he couldn't help but wonder, would seeing her again bring him closure? Or would it open up a wound that had never truly healed? Was he ready to face her after all these years, ready to confront the ghost of a love that had never really died? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't walk away from the possibility of answers, of understanding, of closure, not when he had carried the weight of her absence for so long. Ion took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed his final response. "I'll be there." And just like that, the past had found him again. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, didn't know what the meeting would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he had long since given up on: hope. Ion's heart raced as he stood in front of the park gates. The early morning air was cool, and the world felt still, as though holding its breath. The trees swayed gently, casting long shadows across the path, and the scent of fresh grass hung in the air. He had arrived early, unsure of what to expect, but certain that he couldn't be late. It had been years since he had seen her. 5 years since the day she had walked out of his life, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions. And now, after all this time, she had reached out. The message had been simple, almost cold. "I need to talk. Can we meet?" But to Ion, it felt like a ghost from the past, a haunting that had come back to life. He had spent the night tossing and turning, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. What had changed in the years since they last spoke? What had happened in her life that had led her to reach out now? He didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him, making him question everything. He walked slowly into the park, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet morning. He passed by the benches where they had once sat together, talking about everything and nothing, laughing about silly things, and dreaming about a future that now felt impossibly distant. He couldn't help but stop for a moment, his gaze lingering on the spot where they had shared so many moments. Everything was so different now, so much emptier. Ion pushed the thoughts away, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He had to meet her. He had to hear what she had to say, even if it meant reopening old wounds. There was no turning back now. He reached the fountain at the center of the park, a familiar landmark they had both admired so many times. The water cascaded down in a soothing rhythm, a sound that used to calm him, but today, it did nothing to ease the unease bubbling in his chest. And then, he saw her. She was standing by the fountain, her back to him, looking down at the water. Her hair was different, longer, darker, but there was no mistaking her. It was her. Ion's breath caught in his throat as he watched her for a moment, unsure of how to approach. The years had changed her in small ways, but there was something timeless about her. The way she held herself, the way the world seemed to fall away when she was near. It was all still there, buried beneath the years that had passed. She didn't hear him approach. And for a moment, Ion stood still, frozen in time. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He had imagined this moment so many times over the years, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. Finally, she turned. Her eyes met his, and Ion felt a jolt of recognition, of something ancient and unspoken that passed between them. It was like no time had passed at all. Her gaze was filled with sadness, with a kind of quiet regret that Ion couldn't place. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment just as long as he had. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, as if unsure of herself. It sounded like she was trying to sound casual, but there was an underlying vulnerability in her tone that made Ion's heart ache. "I didn't think I would either," he replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "But I'm here now." She nodded, looking away for a moment as if trying to gather her thoughts. Ion watched her closely, feeling the weight of the years between them. They had both changed. Time had changed them. The young, carefree people they had been when they were together felt like strangers now. And yet, this moment felt like they were still connected, still bound by something that neither of them could explain. "Do you remember this place?" she asked, her voice soft and distant. Ion nodded. "Of course. We spent hours here, just talking, watching the water." She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting back to the fountain. "It feels like another life, doesn't it?" Ion didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain the way her absence had torn his life apart? How could he tell her that all this time, he had been living in the shadow of the love they had shared, trying to hold on to something that had slipped through his fingers. I've thought about this moment 1,000 times, she continued, her voice barely a whisper now. About what I would say to you when I finally saw you again. Ion clenched his fists, his emotions rising up inside him like a storm. And what do you have to say? He asked, his voice sharp, more confrontational than he had intended. She met his gaze, her eyes wide with surprise, but there was no anger in her, no defensiveness, just that same quiet sadness. I'm sorry, she said simply, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry for everything, for how I left, for not explaining, for not saying goodbye. The words hit Ion like a physical blow. He hadn't expected her to apologize, and yet hearing it felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. All these years, he had carried the burden of her leaving, of not knowing why, of not being able to fix whatever had gone wrong. But now, hearing her words, he felt a part of that burden start to shift. I didn't know how to leave. Ion, she continued, her voice trembling now, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't know how to say goodbye without destroying everything we had. I thought leaving was the only way to protect you from me. I thought if I stayed, I would ruin you, ruin everything. Ion shook his head, unable to process everything she was saying. You think leaving was the answer? You think walking away was protecting me? He laughed bitterly, the anger rising in him. Do you know how much it hurt? Do you know how many nights I spent wondering what I had done wrong? Wondering why you disappeared without a word? Her eyes filled with tears, and she took a step closer to him. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I didn't understand back then. I didn't understand how much I needed you to. Ion's heart broke. He had spent so many years resenting her, blaming her for the pain she had caused. But now, in this moment, he could see the depth of her regret, the depth of the battle she had fought within herself. He could see the woman she had become. The woman who had been through things he could never understand. I just wanted you to stay, he whispered, the pain finally spilling out. I wanted you to stay, and I didn't know how to make you see that. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. I know, she whispered, I know now.